Senator, good to see you.
Good to see you.
That's the question many have been asking, which is, what is our strategy in Syria?
There isn't one, and part of the problem early on was, as I had said when this first started, these Islamic terrorist groups, these jihadist groups, they need a vacuum. They need an operating space in order to organize and grow. That's why they're in Libya now. That's why they used Afghanistan before. And when this uprising happened in Syria, which was initially started by Syrians, not by radical jihadists.
There was a time where the good versus evil aspect of this was much more clear. Assad was the bad guy, and there were some good people who wanted better lives.
There were everyday Syrians that were rebelling. There were military defectors that wanted to fight against Assad. We didn't engage at that point. This administration didn't. And then that created this open space, and these radical jihadists flowed there. And it's not just ISIS, it's al-Nusra. It's actually chilling to see that clip that you just played, because in fact, ISIS believes in this prophetic vision that they're going to draw in Western forces on the ground in northern Syria, where there's going to be this apocalyptic showdown between the West and them, and that ultimately it will usher in a world in which everyone lives under their version of Islam.
So why is that not an argument to support President Obama's strategy of staying out of there?
Well, because the bottom line is a couple points. Number one, we wanted to empower people on the ground that were already there to fight against them before they even showed up. Now that they're there, they're going to have to be confronted on the ground, and my argument is that Sunnis themselves are going to have to fight them on the ground, and we need to help them with air support and logistical support.
You want to get folks in the surrounding areas to go in there and
they're
fight
the only ones that can ultimately
We'll support them with air strikes.
Absolutely, but ultimately this is a battle for the future of Sunni Islam, and Sunni Muslims themselves must defeat them both ideologically but also militarily on the ground. They're not going to stop in Syria. Their goal is to move into Saudi Arabia and topple the kingdom and do the same in Jordan and do the same in Lebanon. Their goals are well beyond simply Syria and Iraq.
But what we know now is that Russia's not really targeting ISIS. I mean, they kind of say they are, but our intelligence, our military analysts say, intelligence community, no evidence the Russians have struck ISIS targets in Raqqa, the group's de facto headquarters, and they've done a couple of, it seems like, show strikes to sort of say we're going after ISIS. So what we're going to be left with if the U.S. does nothing is a stronger and more powerful Bashar Assad. What does that mean?
This is part of a very cunning strategy on the part of Putin. What he's saying is, I'm going to destroy all the non-ISIS fighters, and then I'm going to turn to the world and say, okay, guys, the only two people left fighting in Syria are ISIS and Assad. We're on Assad's side. Whose side are you on? He wants to eliminate any other option to toppling Assad.
And we're letting him.
Well, and again, not only are we letting him, but we're doing nothing to help those people that are on the ground, which is why I've said we need to create a safe zone in Syria with the cooperation of our allies, and that will address 3 points. Number one, allowing a non-radical jihadist group to organize and prepare themselves. Number two, to stem some of this flow of migrants that are leaving the region and going into Europe. If they had a place they could stay safely, they wouldn't make that journey. And number three, to ultimately have something in place for a future without Assad, an alternative in the future.
As a practical matter, it's not going to happen, right? Barack Obama's not going to do that. It seems clear. What he wants to do is chat some more with the Russians about how impolitic their decision was. That doesn't seem to be working out so well. So what's going to happen now? Because it looks like what's happening is an alliance between Russia, Iran, Syria, and even potentially Iraq.
Correct.
As that solidifies, what does that mean for the United States?
What that means is there's going to be an Iranian Shia sphere of influence that will cover Iraq and Syria. Increasingly, you're seeing some of that in Yemen and Bahrain. Obviously, Iran is already there in the region. And
Iran's power is growing by the day.
Absolutely. And that's what our allies, the Saudis and others, look at and say, well, these guys are encircling us. I mean, one of the things that's not being reported is the aid that Iran is now providing some elements within Bahrain, where there is a significant U.S. naval presence. Also being underreported is ISIS's growth in Afghanistan.
So as a practical matter, though, the United States, we're not directly in the crosshairs yet, but as they grow and as they band together and as Iran gets more and more powerful, where do you see this going for us, for Israel?
Well, a couple points. They want to drive us from the region. The Iranian goal is to ultimately not just become the dominant power in the region. They want to drive the United States completely out of the region. They want no U.S. military presence, increasingly no U.S. diplomatic presence either. Their goal is to drive us from the region. If they can drive us from the region, they become the most powerful force in the region. These countries become subservient to them. And in addition to that, they can now go after Israel and
You know, so many Americans, they're war-weary. They say Syria. I don't even know who to root for. I'm kind of with Barack Obama and Trump on this. Let's stay out of it. Let the Russians deal with it. Why? I mean, in the simplest terms, why are they wrong?
2 points. Number one is they're not going to, just because we ignore Syria doesn't mean Syria is going to ignore us. Many of those foreign fighters are now finding their way potentially into Europe, and that means they're just now a skip away from the United States. It's also a place that they use to organize efforts on social media and other ways to recruit Americans here at home to attack us. They we are ultimately the big target that they want at the end of the day. They want to target not just our way of life, but ultimately our country by conducting attacks here. And that isn't going to stop because we ignore them. The Russian presence in the region is troubling because they've been out of that region for over 30 some odd years. Their return to that region now gives them a defensive capability that, for example, 5 years from now, Assad is openly involved in arming Hezbollah, and Hezbollah attacks Americans, and we want to strike Hezbollah. We now have to worry that there are Russian assets in there that we may have to take on in order to reach Hezbollah. It almost makes them almost makes them immune to U.S. pressure against them and against Iran as well.
Senator Marco Rubio, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me on.